This is an IWP media production, brought to you by the Institute of World Politics, the independent accredited graduate school empowering the next generation of national security, intelligence, and international affairs experts. Learn from top scholar practitioners and acquire invaluable skills to propel your career. For more information, visit iwp.edu.
Welcome back to the IWP podcast. I'm your host, Jim Robbins, Dean of Academics here at IWP. And today we're joined by Professor Dennis Teti, the IWP faculty. Dennis, thanks for coming today.
Good morning. I'm happy to come and have some discussion, I think, about democracy and elections, which seem appropriate for the time.
Yes, democracy and elections. Everybody's talking about it. Let's see if we can get through this without talking about politics. Dennis, why don't you tell everybody what you do here at IWP?
Right. So I teach the two basic courses that are required of our students. They're mandatory for the students, and one is on the history of Western political and moral thought, in which we go through the thought of the best-known moral and political philosophers in Western culture, and the other is somewhat similar on America, and that's sources of American political thought, so that we try to get our students to understand a little bit better the thinking, the historical thinking that becomes the basis of our society and our political system.
Oh, that's great. And I just want to point out that it's in the charter of our school to teach American founding principles and the Western moral tradition. Mm-hmm. Unlike many schools, we still teach those things so people can understand it.
It's a refreshing difference.
Indeed. And yeah, it's important. Well, particularly, we have people who are going into government, a lot of them who graduate from our school, and it would be nice if they knew what they were defending. The Constitution that they take an oath to.
That's right.
So when we talk about democracy, now you have firsthand experience with democracy because you ran for Congress, is that right?
I did run for Congress. That's a very, very long time ago, further back than I'd like to admit. I ran in the district that includes Jersey City in New Jersey, and I was born and raised in that area. And running for Congress turned out, needless to say, I did not win that election. But running for Congress turns out to be a very interesting educational experience in itself. It was, at least for me, because really my educational background is really in political thought, political theory. But so now I'm faced with political practice. And so you learn many things. And one of the things that I learned is that I was amazed to discover how many people, citizens, who did not necessarily study what I studied, but knew an enormous amount of what it is that's going on, how politics are affecting them, how the programs are affecting them. And some are very articulate, some not necessarily so articulate, but they could make the point. And I was kind of startled. I had this idea that, people don't really pay attention to that. It was not true then, and I'm sure it's not true now. They pay a lot of attention.
Well, yeah, that's important when you talk about the rational voter model or some of these things that we learned in political science. There is a view that the voters are tuned out, they don't care, they're irrational, they don't even vote.
Right.
And that's just not the case.
Right. That view itself is harmful, by the way. I hold that against modern social science and behavioral science. The very view works its way into the way teachers teach about the subject. And that means that they teach subjects, they teach citizens, they teach future citizens that this isn't really important and it doesn't really matter all that much, and you just make choices because you like them, but there's nothing beyond that. And if that were the way our people thought about this, truly speaking, they wouldn't have any argument for democracy. There wouldn't be no argument for it. The argument depends on citizens thinking in one way or another about the common good. And that's going to be the basis of what I talk about in my class, and a good conversation about this. So people can have differences. They obviously have differences about what they think the common good requires. But the beginning has to always be what's good for my country, what's good for my nation. That's the start. And the ability of people to be able to think about that rationally is the justification for democracy as a good, viable system.
Yes, I'm like you. I share the annoyance with the cynicism with which many elites approach democracy. I mean, it's something they'll talk about and wave the flag for and whatnot, but in reality, they think it's kind of burdensome. And also when that gets translated into something you hear these days in particular, and again, I'm not trying to get into politics, but the idea that we're like the Weimar Republic or something, teetering on the edge of fascism. I mean, to me, that's a dig at the voter. That's a dig at the American people, to say that the American people would vote away their freedoms.
Of course it is. So at any point, I would add this much, because this has to do a lot with the founders. Our founders had a deep commitment to the notion that people could govern themselves. They had that commitment. This was an experiment to see, for the first time in human history, could this work viably in practice, okay? But they have this reservation about it. In a certain way, they're very far-seeing, because you see that what they worry about doesn't go away. What they were worried about is instant enthusiasms sweep people. It could be anything. It could be caused by anything. It doesn't matter. But people suddenly become very enthusiastic about something and haven't thought about it very much. So they structured the political system not to defeat popular opinion, but to stretch it out, to force popular opinion to take time to get itself worked through the system. So you want to pass a law. That law may not get passed for a year or two or three, because somebody proposes it, that sounds like a great idea, but we don't know what the faults are, the problems are with it, and that you only do by having a long conversation in Congress, long conversation in media, citizens speaking among themselves, people coming down and describing and testifying to what they think about it. So you want a stretched out process before what it is that people are asking for gets carried through instantly. And that's, in a way, that's a part of what I call the aristocratic part of democracy, which is something we ought to discuss a little bit.
Right. Well, let's talk about democracy, because we keep hearing about democracy. Democracy's on the line in this election. I mean, you kind of hear that every election. They say, no, this time we mean it. So what are we talking about when we talk about democracy? Because I know that your courses look at the whole sweep of the Western tradition, from the roots of democracy in ancient Greece up until the present day. So when you think about democracy, what do you think?
Yeah. So give me a minute or two to
yeah, sum
this.
up 2,000 years, please.
That'll take me maybe a paragraph. So look, when these forms of government were first described, it's fair to say that they were described theoretically and scientifically, classical science, by Aristotle. And Aristotle's book lays out three fundamental forms, and you could see the good sense of it. There can only be the forms. The question is, who rules? Either one person rules, or a few people rule, or the many or everybody rule. And that's it. I mean, there are no other possibilities as pure forms, right? And so the case where the many rule, the people rule, is the case called democracy. Demos means people. But here's the amazing thing, and this we pay no attention to this because this is very important for us. Aristotle makes the point perfectly. There are only so many offices. You only have so many people in the legislature. You've got to have some judges. You've got to have some executives, generals, because generals are part of this too, right? There are only so many. Everyone in society can't do it at once. So Aristotle says, so in a democracy, it's done by turns. How do we decide whose turn it is this year, right? Lottery. Lottery. What does lottery mean? Lottery means everybody who is a citizen gets a little pebble that identifies that person. It's all thrown into a hat, basically, and the names are picked out. So, Jim, you and I could suddenly just discover ourselves being president or a member of the legislature because our name got picked out of a hat.
Right.
That's democracy, because democracy means the rule of everyone. Right? We don't think of it that way, but we do think to this day that what democracy means is somehow or other the people rule, and that's the same. This is the aristocratic element that I was speaking about. Aristotle's definition of the rule of the few, how do the few get to rule? They're chosen. They're chosen. Who do you choose? Answer, the best. Isn't that what you choose?
Oh.
Aristocracy means the rule of the best. And so in an aristocracy, that's the effort that's made, is to find who the best are and pick them. And pick them. So the citizens or some body, other body, picks those people who they believe are the best for this job. Now, aristocracy has come to mean something different. He knows all about that. And what aristocracy has generally come to mean is family bloodlines. That's it, right? So you're a noble, you're the Duke of whatever. Why? Because your father was, and his father was, going back, 12 generations.
Right,
But
so
by
it's
definition, it
an
doesn't
unearned elitism.
It's unearned elitism. Well, there's an argument for it too, but we can put that argument aside. What I'm getting at is, and so there's monarchy, right? The rule of one and the rule of one generally really is bloodline. And the monarch is always somehow related by blood to the previous monarch. So let's hold that aside. But in our form, what the founders really wanted was that the people should rule because the people are the sovereign. The people are the sovereign of this country. The people are the citizens. Therefore, they rule. But they can't all rule at once, as Aristotle says. So instead, what they do is they set up a system of representation. And who becomes our representatives? The best. People are going to go out and vote. People are going to go out and vote in November, right? And they're going to make choices. We disagree about who the best is. That's part of the process. We disagree. But the way in which we are making a choice ultimately is, when all is said and done and all the hoopla is finished, is all citizens think this person is the best person for the country. That's why I picked this person. The only attack on that is from modern social science. Social science has nothing to do with the good. It has to do with your interests, your private interests. If you're in labor, you have to support so-and-so because so-and-so is good for the labor. What about the country? It's not important. That's modern social science. The reason for that, Jim, is because modern social science is not capable, by its own admission, not capable of discussing matters of moral good and bad. That is, that's all relegated to the field, to the area of personal choices and preferences, which we commonly talk about as values, right? That, in other words, the common good does not have a reality. Modern social science is based on that notion. It doesn't have a reality. What has a reality is your interests. and your interests generally are economic interests, or it might be religious interests or something like that. That's the basis on which you pick. If that's the case, then there's no common good.
Well, we can back up a second and jump from political theory to political reality, where you say, the people that we choose will be the best. And I mean, just as a reality check, looking at the current crop of candidates, are they the best? Again, I'm trying to stay out of politics. That's almost a rhetorical question because the answer is so self-evidently no.
I hate to put it that way. There are what? There are over 300 million people in the country. Over 300 million. It's hard to pick out the very best, but I can assure you, if you did this by way of the old democracy, what you're going to get is pretty awful. It's going to be pretty awful. Mm-hmm. Pick a name out of a hat of 330 million. The people who are around, who have all kinds of faults, right? I don't have disagreement. There are all kinds of faults and weaknesses and things that upset half of the people, and the others get upset with the other guy and whatever. But all of these people have gone through themselves a process, usually, that has taken some years for them to get to be where they were, and they know something. They know something about politics, and they know something about rule. The question you're asking has taken on a certain kind of coloring because of the particular, I'm going to say, political horizon we live in today. That political horizon you can call progressivism. Progressivism has had an impact on the kinds of people that we choose, the kinds of people who are offered as candidates.
Right.
And that impact is, to begin with, a long agenda. You choose candidate A, and candidate A has, here's the 10 things we're going to do. Candidate B says, I don't like those 10 things. Here are the 10 things I'm going to do. We're talking about the presidency now. It used to not really be like that. It used to be quite different. It's progressivism that brought on this change, and that change, I think, has not been good, and it's been harmful. And what we've gotten is, in a lot of cases, people who are, there's a word that Hamilton uses, and I forget what they are, what the word is, but masters of the little arts, something like that. It's in the Federalist Papers. They're not so good. The founders did not want that. Mm-hmm. They thought it was possible to do better than just coming up with these kind of manipulators. What Hamilton was saying is these are manipulators, because you make promises to 10 different groups, right? Who knows whether those promises can be done? By the time you go through the process, what turns out is very different. And that's with a lot of these candidates. Can you remember anyone who has ever been elected, I guess you can, who after some period of time, 3 months, 6 months, whatever it is, unfailingly, everybody's saying, boo, that person's really terrible. We just picked them. We just picked them 3 months ago or 6 months ago, and they turn out to be disappointments. They're disappointments because they offer all of these things, and they can't carry the promises through, and not in that way, because the system itself makes it very difficult to do. Mm-hmm. So I would say that previously, candidates, of course they talked about what they would like to do. But when they did, what the ordinary voter is thinking is, Ronald Reagan was kind of like this. The ordinary voter is not looking through and saying, oh, I like 7 of these 10 things. What they're saying is, I trust this guy, or I trust this woman. They seem to think the way I think about what's good for our country, and I trust them to do the right thing.
Yes.
But less and less, we don't do that anymore. Because all based on these agendas, based on advanced progressivism. You see?
So
does that make sense?
Oh, it makes sense to me. I think that the issue that we're dealing with in terms of being able to choose the best is the process by which those choices are presented. That people have to come up through a system. Yeah. And I think particularly these days with social media and other types of communication like that, the way that the culture has drifted, the sensationalism and all this other jazz, that
Yeah.
it kind of weeds out people who would love to do good for the country, but just don't want to deal with it. And also the corrupting presence of money, and where that money comes from, where it goes, what agendas are being served, and so forth. So it would be lovely if we could choose from among the best, but the best may not be interested in being chosen.
Yeah, that's actually been a long term. There is a chapter in James Bryce's book called The American Commonwealth, which was written just before the 20th century. Right? You know what I'm talking
Yeah,
about.
of course.
Maybe that's
A
what you had
classic,
in mind.
yes.
Why the best don't go into politics. So it's been a criticism from the beginning that we don't have the best available. We've had good people, right? And we've had a lot who were not good. This is true historically. But the founders didn't think they were giving us Plato's Republic. The founders,
The opposite.
the founders were giving us something that was something that was good, and that they believed was good. But it doesn't mean that you actually get the aristocrat every time you do it. The hope is we'll get it sometimes. And meanwhile, the system itself is structured so that when you get a lot of second raters, it will carry itself for a while,
Right.
right?
Well, but yeah, and that's an important point, because when we talk about the theory of limits, as you were discussing, one argument could be that in a republic like the one that was set up here, you don't necessarily need the best in politics. You could have the best in something else, in business,
Sometimes.
commerce, engineering, the arts, whatever. But that government's role is to allow the best to flourish in other endeavors. And if you have a limited government, it also limits the damage.
Yeah. Sometimes, maybe even most of the time, that's true. But there are exceptions, and let me give you a clear one. In 1857, when James Buchanan became president, so that's 4 years before Lincoln, and the slavery issue had been raging now for decades. The slavery issue came up early. By 1800, this was already rumbling. And it only for 60 years got worse for reasons we don't have the time to go into. But everybody understood that it was an acute problem. James Buchanan, who was not a bad guy, gave his inauguration address 3 days before the Supreme Court handed down the Dred Scott case, opinion in the Dred Scott case. And what Buchanan said, Lincoln made a charge against him later, but what Buchanan said is, we don't know what the court's going to say. They might give a thumbs up or thumbs down, but I beg you, do whatever the court says, and we can get beyond that crisis. Okay? There's good reason to believe he knew perfectly well what Tawney was going to say, but hold that aside. He thought everyone was going to stand up and salute because Tawney hands down the opinion either slavery is to be valid everywhere or slavery can be banned under the Constitution. Tawney said, ultimately, Constitution can do nothing, Congress can't do anything about slavery in the territories. And Lincoln argued later on that means it can't do anything about it in the states. And that means slavery will become legal again everywhere, even though it's been banned by many states. Anyway, here's the point. When the rumble was coming about in 1859 or 1860, that there were states who were saying, you know what, we're sick of it. Congress, the federal government is imposing the tyranny on us. We're leaving. Buchanan said, they're wrong, but I have no power under the Constitution to do anything about this. Okay. Had we not had the supreme statesmanship of Abraham Lincoln at that point, had we not had that, there would be no United States. Statesmanship of a supreme nature, the very best of the best that's possible, is required sometimes. It's true about George Washington. As first president, Washington was acutely aware that everything that he was doing, everything, he wrote a letter saying this, everything that I'm doing is a precedent for what's going to come after. I'm treading on untrod ground, I think is the word he used, right? He understood this at every second, and that's painful. And we've had other presidents who are president at the time of great crises. They're going to have to be very good. We've been blessed by Providence. I think we've been blessed by Providence that at the right time,
Yes.
we've had the best.
It's amazing how that leadership seems to emerge just when you need it in this country's history. It's what's preserved us.
But that's not unconnected with the fact that we are a democratic and a kind of aristocratic democratic country. The leadership makes itself available. The statesman makes himself available. He could have been born in a log cabin out in the West with, who lives there? A couple of log cabins in the forest. That could be the person, totally isolated. Could be born in the, and raised in the middle of some gigantic city, lost in the millions in the crowd. Somehow or other, this system filters those people through. It filters them through, and they make themselves available. If they make themselves available, this is what the founders are saying, if they make themselves available, we have a good shot at getting good people in these positions. The trick is getting them to come through the filters.
Yes.
That's the point that you're making, I think, about why shouldn't the best go into other fields? In other fields, they make themselves through the filters. It's not that much of a problem. If you have genius in IT, you can do it. There are all kinds of things that you have to do, but that's why, because that drives you. This has something to do with this point. It drives you. That's a desire you have. It's a field you like, and by God, you're going to do it.
Yes.
Right? And we have an open society that makes that possible. Same thing is true on the political level, rightly speaking. Then there is a connection between being ambitious and being a great statesman. There's a connection between those two.
Oh, yes.
His Abraham Lincoln's law partner called him at one time a little engine of ambition. He knew what he wanted to do. You'd read his old speeches way before he became president, and you can see reading between the lines what he's saying. You can see it.
Oh, certainly.
So we need to have that too. You need to have people who are ambitious and who think they're good enough to do the job. And it's up to the citizens to determine whether we want to trust them with that or not.
Okay, so a counterpoint to this wonderful system that we're talking about is something that I know that you and others have referred to as the administrative state. Sort of the growth of bureaucrats, regulations, and even among politicians, kind of an attitude that, all this democracy it'd be much better if we didn't have to have all that fuss, that really they know better than the people who vote for them what's good for the people, and so the people should really just shut up and let the administrators take care of everything. So could you expound on that a little bit?
Yeah, that's, I call that the overall political question of our time. Beyond the issue, should we have $5,000 tax credits for housing or something? The really important question that has to be decided is, what do we do with the administrative state? Is this a good thing or a bad thing? The administrative state is what progressivism called for. Progressivism is a movement that came about around the turn of the 20th century. The general idea of the movement of progressivism, which draws on modern European political theory, that's where it comes from. The general idea of it is the political world, the democratic world, is messy. It involves all of these things we've been talking about, various interests and a lot of money and people manipulating people. And the results that you get turn out to be a mess. They're not good. Why should we have all of this? That should be replaced by people who know. They should be replaced by scientists. Scientists means social scientists. And experts, people who have expertise in the field. So let's say the EPA, let's talk about climate.
Right.
Okay.
Um,
There are people.
Of course, the recent Supreme Court case that, is highly relevant to that, which said that, which pulled back some of the power of the administration.
Yeah. So this is this is now there is a big pushback on it, and that's a major part of this thing. But what I'm discussing here is the way of thinking, and that way of thinking has dominated our country. It's fair to say, in a serious way, from around 1933. Okay, and the argument is, any country needs to be efficient, needs to apply its resources properly, and needs to be run by people who know what they're doing. By definition, ordinary, average people like me don't know this stuff. I know things, but, ask me something about how you should build a home. I worked at was employed at HUD for 11 years of my career as a political appointee, not as an administrator. Not right? So I couldn't, if you asked me, how do you build a home? I can't tell you how to build a home. That is to say, I can't tell you what the codes ought to be, the kinds of materials that should be used for all of these kinds of, this is a little example. And so we get a HUD precisely because there are people out there who know this stuff. And they do know this stuff. Let me deal with this a little bit, Jim, if you don't mind. There is a mistake that many, many people make who are critics of the administrative state. And the mistake is this. They say, these administrators are all lazy, they don't do their work, and they don't know what they're talking about. Okay? One of the things I learned when I was at HUD is that's not true by and large. The people, particularly the more senior staff at HUD, who were their career bureaucrats, they know their stuff. They know it. What they don't know, because they can't and they're not trained in this, is politics. That is to say, they don't understand the priorities, because the question about priorities, how much money should be spent on advancing the codes. We want to promote the codes. That means housing is going to become more expensive. How much should be spent on that? They can't determine that. They can tell you how much they would like to, but every agency in the government is telling you how much more money ought to be spent for this priority, that improvement, whatever, right? The question of the budget of the United States as a whole is a political question. It's not a scientific question. There is no science that can answer that question.
Right.
Right? That's a judgment that the people need to make, and the people who are the political leaders. Therefore, that means the administration has to be subordinated to the common good. The notion of the administrative state does away with the common good. Let the bureaucrats run things. So we want now to spend, I don't know, $5 billion more than we did last year on housing. Spend it, because the administrators say to do it.
Right.
And the other thing that's fair to say is every administrator knows his own silo. The administrators don't know the other silos. They're not trained to know that. People in those silos know them. Those things have to be put together. So there are people at HUD that know about, building apartment buildings, large apartment, but they don't know anything. Those people don't know about single-family homes. Question, in our town, should we build more single-family homes, which are pricey, right? Or should we build apartments of some sort or another, which mean that different kinds of people will be brought into the town because different kinds of people are renters, and particularly if they're low rent people, people who are being subsidized by the government. That decision is not an administrator's decision. That's a political decision. That means the progressive state at best has real limits. The big questions it can't decide. The bureaucrats don't have a science for it. The science is politics itself. So what's happened now is the administrative state has run away with itself. When you listen to people today who are running, basically the people who are running are simply saying, let the administrators do more. Unsurprisingly, that itself creates a jumble, a mess, taxes that are too high, an economy that is inflated a great deal, and people act as if we don't know where this came from. But when you examine the administrative state, you can see where it comes from. It comes from the refusal to govern it. That's what this case was about.
Yes.
So the case is saying we can't take for granted every decision that's made by the administrators. That has to go back into the political arena for us to determine whether that was a wise decision or not.
One of the things that comes out of this debate over the administrative state has been, lately especially, an attack on the idea of the debate itself. Calls for more censorship, calls for more deference to the political system. People saying, oh, what about the good old days when we didn't have so many means of expression, social media, X, Facebook, or whatnot. You have John Kerry, for example, someone who I think could be the poster child for the administrative state, saying the First Amendment is a roadblock. But wasn't the First Amendment supposed to be a roadblock?
A filter, as I like to say, a filter. It's a filter. That is a means of slowing down what must take place. What must take place, that's what I was saying a few minutes ago. What must take place is a long conversation.
Right.
We need, therefore, the debate and the dialogue is essential, and the First Amendment guarantees that the government is not going to create a barrier to that. And Kerry is clearly saying, but it's a barrier. That is right.
Just shut up and do what we tell you.
Right.
Yeah, stop with all this free speech and discussion.
So the reason for that is closely connected with the point that I was making before. The very idea of progressivism, of the administrative state, is scientists rule. Scientists rule. Science is not a matter of public debate. Science is just, it's true or not true. The scientists do experiments, they do research, they have a method, and that method ultimately will show us whether some proposal, some scientific proposal, is good or bad. That has nothing to do with public debate. Therefore, why do we have public debate? All that public debate is doing is intervening in what science itself shows us is true or not true. And, right, so we just went through this for the last 4 years over COVID and the huge wars about COVID. The COVID battle came down to this. The scientists understand the science, are working on the research for the science, and science will show us these vaccines are valid, people should not congregate in more than whatever, right? All the scientific rules. That's what the science will show us. Let's grant that the scientists know that some of that stuff is true for the most part. That's what they're going to say. That's the notion of science. Then the question is, are the public supposed to stand up and salute? Or aren't there political problems that come up? For example, the entire economy might collapse while everybody is sitting at home, masked, waiting for this crisis to go over. That's a concern that the medical scientists can't deal with. It's outside their purview. That's a decision that's to be made by political leaders, separate from what the administrators are telling them, right?
Oh, sure.
So for the First Amendment...
But wait, the whole slogan, trust the science, was just used as a cudgel to silence debate. And we know now that some of the things that the so-called scientists, and in some cases they were not scientists, but just administrators came up with, like the stand 6 feet apart, was just made up. That they just pulled it out of a hat. They had no basis for it. Some of the other things that were mandated, for being effective for stopping the scourge of COVID, in fact turned out to not be effective. And so, but that dogmatic trust the science attitude, I mean, people were going to jail over that.
Yes, that's true. And so that means, among other things, the administrative state does not take account, and I'm glad you bring it up, the administrative state idea doesn't take account of the fact that every administrator is also a human being who has a certain political opinion, like it or not, admit it or not, they have a political opinion, meaning that they're citizens too, right? So of course, the scientist now, the expert, disguises the political opinion as a scientific opinion. Maybe doesn't even disguise it because he thinks of it that way.
Exactly.
We all tend to think of everything as an expression of what it is that we do. And the scientists do that too, the bureaucrats as well. The bureaucrat thinks it would be good if people were separated by at least 6 feet because it's just better, there's less risk. That's probably true, there's less risk. So they now promulgate that as a scientific rule, but that's necessarily the case, and certainly not a reason for punishing people, arguably. I don't want to become part of this debate. I want to make clear what is the issue that's involved with the First Amendment. And the First Amendment was the attempt of the founders to make certain that political arguments and disagreements are allowed to go on. But the administrative state is saying political arguments and disagreements are disorderly, create problems for efficient society, and they're bad and they don't solve everything. The scientists solve everything. Therefore, there should be less public debate.
Right, and people who have incorrect opinions should not be allowed to express
Because
those
science can
opinions.
tell us what the incorrect opinions are, except
Right.
the problem is science really can't always tell you that. It really can't always tell you that.
Absolutely. So in political science, and I mean, we could talk about scientists versus bureaucrats and who actually runs things, but that aside, but in political science, there's this notion of the realigning election, certainly in American political science, that an idea that was popular years ago and studied became less popular just as a field of study, but the notion that you have elections that symbolize or become inflection points or show that society is changing in a certain way, that the politics has changed fundamentally. The old debates are gone. You have new terms of debate. Is that what we're seeing right now? Is that happening right now?
Yeah. I don't have a definite answer, yes or no, about that. That notion includes what's called a watershed election. And a watershed election is of the sort that we get every once in a while. Used to be sometimes like every generation, maybe every 30 years, it varies. But in a watershed election, the candidates who are running, particularly the presidential candidates, are sharply different about something, which we need to talk about. They're sharply different. One of those candidates is almost always the candidate who represents the way we have understood the political world for the last X years. And they're saying, this is good and we ought to continue it because this is what America is like. And the other candidate says, fundamentally wrong, it's based on premises that are incorrect about what America means. And what has happened over the last couple of years is, as a matter of fact, America has been harmed and we've moved away from the founding principles of this country. We need to restore that. The voter is now faced with this, and the voter is compelled to make some decision of a kind that I believe voters don't like making, which is why you don't get this all the time. And who wants to make a decision like that? You kind of want everybody to get along and agree, and voters don't like the feeling we're being forced to make this choice. It's not that the candidates are bad, by the way. This is what's said today about the current candidates, right? This is the cant. We don't like any of these people. They're terrible. That's not the point. The point is the whole perspective that they have on politics and what government should be doing is sharply different, and you're going to have to make a choice as a citizen. In a watershed election, once that choice is made, there is an understanding that has now come about because of that election about what government should do. And the inclination is for many years after that, a generation easily, it keeps repeating itself, right? So can I give you a couple of news, because a couple of numbers about this that help you understand it, and then I want to get at the question that you're asking me, is that where we are? We had a realignment election under Franklin Roosevelt. This is really very remarkable stuff.
1932.
1932. And up until that time, we had 72 years of Republican government, beginning with Abraham Lincoln. 72 years under which the Republicans were the majority party, and I'm going to show you how strong that is, but I won't talk about the Republicans. Franklin Roosevelt, for the first time now, has this election, forces a difference, forces voters to make a choice. Voters go with him big time. We know why. Mainly, it's in the middle of the horrible Depression, and he successfully made the argument that government had walked away from any concern with ordinary Americans. His defense was of ordinary Americans. It's very important to understand that. The average American had been abandoned, and that the previous government, the Republican government, had been a defender of big business, big corporate interests. Roosevelt said in his inauguration address that we have chased the money changers from the temples. Chased this wonderful rhetoric, right? So the temple has been cleansed. That's serious stuff. The temple's been cleansed. These guys were not Americans. We've kicked them out and we've replaced them, right? So here's what I'll say about the Roosevelt realignment. The realignment lasts, in my reading, 48 years, and I think that kind of comes to an end with Ronald Reagan. So I'm going to talk about the difference between that time period. For 30 years, 63% of all those years, the Democrats controlled the White House and both houses of Congress. 30 years, not in a row, but for the most part. You know You know how many times Republicans controlled the White House and Congress in all that time? 2 years. The first 2 years of Eisenhower. It's the only time that Republicans ever had that, and it went away right away. It went away. The Democrats had the White House 32 of those years. The Republicans had the White House 16 years. Democrats overwhelmingly had that. Control of Congress itself. Democrats had control for 44 years of 48 years. That means 92% of the time. For that whole period, it was under Democrat control. That came to sort of an end when Reagan was elected. So that what that means is this: between 1933, when Roosevelt became president, and 1981, when the election took place, there were important changes that took place in our society. The economy itself changed, and the way people perceive their interests are not necessarily the same. Because at the end of it, by Reagan's time, this issue that we've been talking about progressivism or the administrative state, was now growing a lot. And there are many, many people, working people, right, blue-collar workers, who were always traditionally associated with Roosevelt and the Roosevelt Revolution, and they were blue-collar workers, they were Democrats to the death, began to see that the administrative state was creating problems for them. Reagan learned this, by the way, because when Reagan was doing TV in the 50s, he used to go around. His TV program was, the sponsor was General Electric, and he used to go around to General Electric factories. So he was the presenter, and he would go around the factories, and he would just talk to workers. How are things? What's going on, so on. And he said, I began to notice after a while, even at that point, working people in these factories would complain to me that Washington is constantly interfering with it, telling the machinery is not right, this isn't right, and all kinds of interferences going on. And he picked that up and began to sense that that was an issue. So by the time he ran in 80, it was a big issue. Okay, so now comes a new realignment of a sort. And that realignment, I think it's fair to say that a biggest part of that was blue-collar workers, the lower middle to middle-income people, significant number of them deciding the Democratic Party is now different from what it is before, and they decided to move to Reagan.
So-called Reagan Democrats.
These were so-called Reagan Democrats, but those people are more or less now a very significant part of that new majority that Reagan formed. Now, the thing about, so we have now gone through, this is the point I want to make, we've gone through 44 years of the Reagan Revolution. We've gone through about the same time as the Franklin Roosevelt Revolution, because Reagan was elected in 80. So we've gone through 44 years already of it. And remember I said the Democrats under Roosevelt controlled Congress 92% of the time. That means had both houses. Reagan is a Republican. How many times, how long, what kind of control of Congress did the Republicans have? 14 years out of 44, 32% of the time. That's nothing like what Roosevelt was able to do. Not only that, if you ask the question, how many years did the Democrats control Congress during this Reagan period and post-Reagan period? The answer is 14 years. Same amount of time. People have not decided that they are now, that the Republicans should run the country, have not decided Democrats should run the country. And a good sign of that is, for how many years have we had a Republican chamber on one side and a Democrat chamber on the other, like we do now? Split Congress, right? 16 years, 36% of the time. The control of the presidency. Republicans have had the presidency since Reagan was elected 24 years. Democrats had it 20 years. No decision.
A lot more divided government.
It's divided, and so now you have to ponder the question, what does that mean and why are people voting this way? Why are they doing that? I have a theory about it. My theory may be totally wrong, but I can only guess. My theory is this. A great deal of the administrative state, which includes things like, at the beginning, Social Security and Medicare, Americans have come to an agreement that we need this. That was part of the early administrative state. I think Americans came to agree that that's okay. Reagan signed on to that. Up until the time when Reagan ran, take Barry Goldwater, right? Republicans were extremely opposed to all of those things. They were constantly pushing back. And Americans were not willing to trust Republicans. Reagan came to the conclusion, Reagan used to say, I'm not against the New Deal, I'm against the Great Society, which is something that came later. Mm-hmm. But the basic New Deal administrative state, which is much smaller, I think that he was able to make Americans feel, I can trust the Republicans not to destroy this. And that's about as far as we've gone. So we are now living within a horizon that is being participated in by Republicans and Democrats. We've agreed basically that at least the early elements of the administrative state, we're not going to oppose them. The administrative state grew to be too big. And so, sure, some Republicans want to push back on it, but they don't want to get rid of it. That means, in other words, that the parties are in a certain basic agreement about it. They are not Barry Goldwater anymore. That went away.
But, all right. But I just have to say something.
This is an unhappy situation.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to get to.
Unhappy situation.
But wait, look at the economics of it. Okay, we've agreed on this. Through all these years of divided government. However, bipartisanship is non-existent.
Right.
We're governing through continuing resolutions that have no vision other than just like funding stuff so the government doesn't shut down.
Right.
We have debt as a percentage of GDP that is higher than World War II, and yet we are not fighting a two-front global conflict, and it's scheduled to keep going up and up and up. $1 trillion debts just as a matter of course, just on and on, no attempt whatsoever at any kind of spending discipline. And now you're having people talking about strange new taxes like wealth taxes and unrealized gains taxes that would be impossible and unconstitutional and economically devastating. So you could say that we have agreed on these basic things, but in fact, we're just spending our country into oblivion. So how do you fix that?
Right. That's the question. And the answer to that is this. I repeat what I said before. The question is, every realignment is a realignment that exists within a new horizon that's established, and this is the horizon we have been living with during this period of time. It takes the form that it does because people essentially like the early programs. Okay? That can't change until some political party, some candidate is willing to say that this is not based on the principles that this country was ever founded on. This has gone so far away that what we have now is not recognizable. What we have now, if it resembles anything, resembles old Europe. Because that's what the administrative state is. When old Europe, which we fought a revolution to leave, was a Europe that was based on the rule of nobles, old bloodline aristocrats, and monarchs. In some cases, priests, ministers, generals, but it was not based on democracy. It was not based on the rule of the people. We broke with that. We said that that was unjust, it was unfair, it was a violation of equality, violation of natural rights. That's what we said. Under progressivism, there has been this inclination to say, Woodrow Wilson said this again and again. Wilson, who was kind of the intellectual leader of this, We need to learn lessons from Europe. And we have candidates who tell us that. We need to learn lessons from Europe. What are the lessons from Europe? Less interference by people. We don't want people involved in this stuff. And as we do it, then the administrative state keeps growing, generating these kinds of problems. That will continue until some candidate is able to articulate clearly an alternate vision that's rooted in our founding principles and to explain to people it doesn't have to be that way, and it's wrong and it's a violation of everything that we ever stood for. That's a hard call. When that takes place, we will have a watershed election that we talked about at the beginning. When that takes place.
Yeah, let me just add, not to mention the people who say we have to learn from China, but that's a whole nother discussion. But here's my question for you. Do we need, like 1932, do we need a big crash? Because that's coming. I mean, you can't sustain the kind of economy, government spending and debt that we have right now forever, not without massive economic growth, which I don't think anyone's predicting. Do we need another crash to have that realignment that you're talking about?
We had a crash in 2008. It was nasty in 2008. And one of the interesting things about it, because I was fairly close to a lot of what was going on with that, so I can speak personally, but let me hold that aside. The interesting thing about 2008, the financial meltdown, right, is the geniuses, the scientists, all of the people who were chosen because of their expertise, never predicted it, not a single one. No one predicted it. Nobody saw it coming. It just took place by itself, right? And you know what happened after that? They passed a bill. What is the name of it? I forget. I'll think of it in a second. The Dodd-Frank. Dodd-Frank made major, massive changes in banking and financial institutions, the heart and soul of which is every time that somebody at one of the places like the FDIC or one of the other financial regulating agencies thinks that there's something wrong with some bank, that bank can be taken over by the feds, just because they think there's something wrong with it. Just because they think. And what was the justification? Because we don't want to allow a 2008 all over again. But if you couldn't predict it, show us why the next one you can predict. Show us why. Mm-hmm. They never do that, right? So that's among the other reasons to believe it's coming. They don't have the tools to do this. It will come. I point to 2008 because I say that really was a time when I thought we're going to get the change we need to have. And what we got was more of the same. Mm-hmm. That's what we got. You don't like the way things are now? We're going to give you more progressivism. We're going to expand the size of the administrative state, which means that we had no candidate who put their finger on the problem. We're going to have another one. Absolutely, I agree with you. We're going to have a candidate to finger the problem. Maybe. We will have other crises. We could have a very nasty foreign affairs crisis, international crisis. You see that all around you. When that happens too, that is a problem because a lot of our difficulties, some of them, are the administrative state's foreign interest, because progressivism has its foreign dimension as well as its domestic dimension. So that's part of the same problem. So God forbid that we should have a terrible thing come up, but it's very possible. Mm-hmm. Those are the opportunities when people are put into a position where if a candidate is prepared to say, we need to think this through much more than we have done. But until someone puts that to them, people tend to think in terms of these small things, right? So we have some critic on the other side, and he's not the guy who's running the government, so let's give him a chance. But there's no solution. And particularly if the parties have done what I'm just saying that I believe that they have done, which is basically signed off on that social contract, they've signed off on it, it doesn't invite any change. To change one person for another person is not the answer. The answer is changing fundamentals of that system. And that has to come from the candidate explaining it.
But can the system survive that? Because you see people, there was something in Atlantic the other day, just saying we need to get rid of the Constitution, that we need to,
Oh, yeah, that's
you
sure.
know,
That's sure a solution.
that we need, well,
I know
seriously,
they
that we
say
need
it.
that kind of fundamental
They say
change,
it.
that we need
They say
to,
it.
you know, take the Supreme Court out of the picture, or, you
Yeah.
know, or pack it or whatever, but change its powers so that it can no longer be part of the, you know, the slowing down mechanism of the role that it plays. There are a lot of extremely radical views that are more and more infiltrating their way into mainstream politics.
Yeah.
So could the crash not lead to a reset, as has happened, but to something completely different?
Every watershed election is a big risk. Every election is a big risk. And therefore, this is not a question, can democracy succeed? This is what the founders asked. Is it possible for self-government to perpetuate itself? That was the big question. And as it's developed and as they saw, and as Abraham Lincoln used to make this point, it's always an experiment. It's never completed. Nobody ever is able to write down, here's a star, you got 100 for this one. You only got 100 for the last crisis you went through. It's because politics is like that. And that means, yes, there's no guarantee. And it could be the Constitution would get written off. But let me only say, things like that have come up before. When they have come up before, solutions like, let's just nullify the laws that we don't like. Washington passes laws, let's nullify them. That didn't work. That would have been a disaster. Let's pull out of the country. What's radical in that? Nothing has been proposed today yet that is as radical as the proposal for secession. But the proposal for secession is the end of the country. It's finished, right? With the blessing of a statesman at the time, supreme nature, who was able to figure out how to prevent that, and that was not merely military. Military was essential, but it was his understanding of the powers and the meaning. Okay, so today, the Constitution, which has always been in the past a pain in the neck, because the Constitution erects all kinds of things that stop you from getting instantly what it is you want. This is a long, complicated process. The Constitution imposes limits on government, and there are a lot of people who don't like the limits, right? So the proposals come up from time to time. We ought to just junk this. That offers a risk and a tremendous opportunity, because the Constitution should never have been taken for granted. And I'm afraid for generations, Americans have taken it for granted. Taking it for granted means we never really truly understand what is so magnificent about this thing. This thing is magnificent. But nothing like this in the history of civilization. Nothing like this Constitution, for a good number of reasons. And therefore, at some point or another, the opportunity presents itself for somebody to defend it and to say, you know what our crisis is? Because this is the truth. Our crisis is we have lost the Constitution. We've moved away from it. We are not governing ourselves by this constitutional method, and that's what we need to do. If we did, we wouldn't have an administrative state, because that's what the administrative state is. It's the substitute for constitutional government, right? So it's an opportunity and a great risk. And the important thing for Americans is to come to see that there's a lot at stake when it comes down to that. When the time comes that we are presented with a genuine debate like that, how much is going to be at stake? These things are implicitly at stake now, because you've already pointed out that the problems are here. We see these problems. Are we going to see the consequences? We might see the consequences.
Well, Dennis, I think we're going to have to end it with that. hopefully a hopeful note. We've been talking to Professor Dennis Teti on democracy and the American Constitution here on the IWP podcast. Thanks for joining us. I'm Jim Robbins, and we'll see you again next time on the IWP podcast.
Thanks so much, Jim.
If you like our podcast and would like to hear more, please subscribe. And if you are interested in learning more about the topics we covered here today and want to be a student at IWP, go to iwp.edu and click Apply now.